Fake HOA cops try to raid my ranch with fake vests and a clipboard, but they didn't know I'm a former Navy SEAL. 120 acres of freedom. That's what I thought I'd earned after years of sweat, scars, and silence. No bosses, no chaos. Just me, my dogs, my goats, and a tractor older than my bones. But then Karen Simmons and her fake HOA cops rolled in, thinking they could raid my ranch with a clipboard and some vests. They didn't know I'm a former Navy SEAL, and they sure as hell didn't know they'd walked into my trap. This is HOA Karen Files, where we expose the tyrants who think they can take what's ours. If you've got a Karen story, drop it in the comments. And don't forget to smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. Let's dive into the fight that turned my ranch into a battlefield. Chapter 1. The Sign and the Smirk. I'd spent 20 years chasing silence. The kind that doesn't scream danger. The kind that lets your shoulders drop and your breath steady. After 2 decades as a Navy SEAL, I'd seen enough noise. Gunfire in Kandahar. Orders barked through static. The hum of a hello before a drop. When I bought this ranch, 120 acres of rolling green in Simmons Valley, I thought I'd found it. Freedom, paid for in sweat and scars. Number 4 a.m. calls, no strangers yelling in my face. Just me, my border collie Max, a herd of goats, and a tractor that groaned like it had arthritis. I'd built the porch myself, sanded the cedar till it gleamed, and every morning I'd sit there, sipping coffee, watching the sun climb over the hills. It wasn't just land. It was home. The kind that whispers you're safe. I thought I was done with conflict. I thought wrong. It started with a sign, white, plastic, zip-tied to my fence like it had every right to be there. Notice, property under review, Simmons Valley HOA, compliance required. I stood there, coffee mug steaming in the October chill, blinking at it like it might explain itself. It didn't. Simmons Valley HOA? This was farmland. The only community standard out here was not hitting a cow with your truck. I figured it was a prank, some bored kids playing HOA cosplay. So I ripped it down, tossed it in the fire barrel, and went back to fixing the east fence. That was my first mistake, underestimating how far someone will go when they think a clipboard gives them power. The next day, she showed up. An SUV the color of hospital walls rolled up my gravel drive, parked halfway across like it was a tactical maneuver. Out stepped a woman, mid-50s, overweight, shoulder-length blonde hair, dressed in pastel pink khakis and mirrored sunglasses that screamed, "I'm important." She had a clipboard tucked under her arm like a sidearm, and she didn't look at my land. She looked at me, like I was a problem to be solved. "Hi there," she chirped, voice sweet as store-bought pie, the kind that's all sugar and no soul. I wiped my hands on a rag, leaned against the fence post, and sized her up. "Help you. I'm Karen Simmons, HOA president," she said, smiling wider, like we were about to swap recipes. "Just doing my rounds. Thought I'd personally welcome you to the neighborhood." I blinked. HOA. Her smile didn't budge. Simmons Valley Homeowners Association. We're a chartered community coalition focused on maintaining visual and environmental standards across properties. I laughed, couldn't help it. This is farmland. The only visual standard out here is not crashing into cows. She didn't flinch, just kept that smile, the kind that says she's heard it all before and doesn't care. Our bylaws cover fencing height, structure types, livestock ratios, and noise thresholds. We're in an awareness phase, but citations begin at the end of the month. I crossed my arms, coffee mug still in hand. "Lady, you can't cite a goat." Her eyes gleamed behind those sunglasses. "Oh, we don't cite the goats," she said, voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Just their owners." She handed me a manila envelope. "Welcome packet. Action required." And before I could reply, she spun on her orthopedic heel and walked off like she'd just served a jury summons. I opened it right there, standing in the gravel, Max sniffing at my boots. Page after page of fake regulations, diagrams of my barn with red circles, photos of my fencing from angles I didn't even know existed, a note about my satellite dish being a visual obstruction in the southern view corridor. I didn't throw it out. I burned it, watching the flames curl the edges, thinking that'd be the end of it. Mistake number 2, assuming Karen would stop. 2 days later, new signs appeared. Bigger, laminated, zip-tied higher. One stapled to my barn door. Under enforcement review, violations pending. I tore them down again, but this time they came back with nails and men. Two of them, late 30s, matching khakis, vests with iron-on patches that read HOA Patrol. I watched from the porch as they walked my fence line, walkie-talkies crackling, clipboards in hand like they were on a mission. One pointed at my tractor, muttering into his mic. I stepped off the porch, boots crunching gravel, and they froze like deer hearing a shotgun. "Something I can help you with, boys?" I asked, voice low but firm. One spoke, nervous, rehearsed. "We're conducting a compliance sweep under HOA protocol." I walked closer, eyes on their vests. "Got a badge?" "We operate under the Simmons Valley Charter," he said, dodging the question. "Great," I replied. "Then you're trespassing under the Callahan Property Charter. Leave." They did, but not before one dropped his clipboard. I picked it up, patrol maps, routes, properties marked with red X's. Mine was labeled Alpha, high resistance. I snapped a photo, then called a buddy in town, Sheriff Langston. He hadn't heard of any HOA, but he knew Karen. "Oh yeah," he said, voice gruff through the line. "She tried to find the feed store last year, called it a rural noise disturbance. She's trouble." That's when I realized this wasn't a one-time thing. Karen had plans that didn't stop at laminated signs, plans that included men with walkie-talkies, fake websites, patrols, and maybe worse. I started prepping, not for war, for nonsense. Motion sensors, trail cams, remote lights. Nothing lethal, just enough to remind them this land bites back. I'd spent years in the SEALs learning how to hold ground, how to turn the enemy's confidence into their downfall. If Karen wanted to play, I'd be ready. Because the next time they crossed my line, they weren't walking away with a warning. And the next time they came, they didn't knock. They came before dawn, in silence, and they brought backup. You don't forget what trouble sounds like when it's trying to be quiet. There's a rhythm to it, measured, careful, like a heartbeat just a tick too fast. I heard it before I saw anything. The wind was dead, sky still black. Even the chickens hadn't started their morning arguments. But that crunch on the gravel, too heavy for wind, too light for a truck, too damn coordinated for a deer, set my nerves on edge. I didn't panic, just grabbed my boots and mug, half full with yesterday's reheated coffee, muscle memory kicking in. I didn't have to look. I already knew they were back. Karen's fake HOA troops, her clipboard commandos, had returned. I'd figured they'd try again, just not this soon. I stepped into the kitchen, flicked off the interior lights, quieted my breathing, and listened. Crunch, pause, crunch, multiple sets, 5, maybe 6. I moved to the side window by the barn. 5 shadows in a lazy arc, vests, khakis, flashlights off, radio earpieces in. One had a clipboard, because apparently even paramilitary LARPers need paperwork. The kicker, headlamps strapped to their foreheads, like coal miners or discount special forces. I crouched low, scanned. 3 veered toward the east fence where Linda, my lead goat, slept like royalty. 2 hung near the front gate. Then a voice crackled through a radio, half-whispered. "Team Alpha in position. Begin sweep. Target is presumed armed but compliant under Phase 1. Phase 1. I chuckled, but the laugh didn't reach my eyes. Something in me shifted. That old hum returned, the one I hadn't felt since Kandahar. The weight behind the eyes, the coiled breath in the lungs, awareness, training, threat assessment. I moved to the mudroom, slipped on the coat with the emergency light trigger in the pocket. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted to see what happened when they saw me fight back. They crossed the second fence, quiet, confident, until one tripped the wire. Click, then boom. Not an explosion, a flood of light and sound. High-beam floodlights burst on like I'd summoned God with a remote, sirens screaming from 4 spots. The barn lit up like Times Square. 2 guys dropped flat. One screamed and dove behind the water trough. Another collided with Linda's enclosure. Bad move. Linda rammed him in the thigh, flipped him over, and stared down at him like she expected an apology. I stepped onto the porch, didn't rush, didn't yell, just sipped my coffee and said, "Good morning, gentlemen. Y'all planning to announce yourselves? Or were you hoping for the element of surprise?" One straightened, clipboard guy. "We are acting under HOA Emergency Code 7A to seize non-compliant property," he said, voice steady but eyes darting. "Emergency Code 7A?" I raised an eyebrow. "Did y'all make that up in a coloring book?" He didn't flinch. We are empowered by community vote to remove unauthorized structures, reclaim misuse of land, and enforce property value security. You gonna enforce it with that clipboard? I asked. Another one, shaking, sweating, raised something that looked like a taser. This is a citizens enforcement zone, he said, voice cracking. We are within operational bounds. I took one step down from the porch. You're in my yard, armed, threatening seizure of property under fake laws printed on a library computer. Clipboard guy pulled out a folder. This document authorizes us. I snatched it. Half the pages said draft. One had a coffee stain. Another had melted cheese stuck to the corner. This looks like it was written by a sleep-deprived 10th grader with control issues, I said, tossing it to the ground. Then I heard gravel, tires, a car, but not one of theirs. Sheriff Langston's red and blue lights stuttered down the driveway like divine intervention. His squad car rolled in, slow and loud. The HOA enforcers froze. Clipboard guy turned, muttered, "Abort," but it was too late. Langston stepped out, squinting into the chaos. One fake cop was still being screamed at by Linda. Another had his face in the dirt like it offered legal protection. Langston looked at me, deadpan. "Callahan, what the hell is this?" "Prairie Theater. Opening act," I said. "HOA SWAT team." He turned to the group. "Hands where I can see 'em. Drop the clipboards." One guy actually said, "We're acting under civilian compliance jurisdiction." Langston walked up, grabbed the badge on his vest, and ripped it off. "Buddy, this says Compliance Officer Tier 2. You're lucky it doesn't say Mall Cop." He held up a binder, leather-bound, homemade, cover reading Simmons Valley Compliance Authority, Internal Codex. Langston flipped through color-coded charts, rank structure, lamination. He read aloud. Class 1 violation, fencing misalignment. Class 2, unauthorized rooster activity. Class 3, hostile resident behavior. He snapped it shut. "I've seen cults with fewer rules." One guy blurted. "We were told to enforce protocol." "By who?" Langston asked. I said it first. "Karen." 3 arrests, 2 citations, 1 full report filed with the county investigator. But the kicker, Langston found a list tucked in the binder, a spreadsheet with names, mine highlighted red, obstructionist, high threat. Others were crossed out. "You know any of these?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Neighbors. 2 sold out this year. 1 went dark." "This isn't just HOA cosplay," he said, voice low. "This is coordinated. Targeted." He sighed. "I'll call in a fraud investigator, maybe even the feds. But you should know, Karen's doubling down. She's not quitting." I already knew. Later that night, a certified letter landed in my mailbox. Not mailed, hand-delivered. Karen was suing me for hostile disruption of a sanctioned community action, undermining volunteer enforcement personnel, and intentional obstruction of cooperative land reclamation. The worst part, she had a real lawyer. Someone was funding her, someone with more reach than a folding table and a clipboard. Tucked inside the envelope was a list of names, not just mine, not just neighbors, but one I knew better than anyone. Someone I'd shared beers with, someone who'd helped build my barn. Next to their name, a single word, informant. Power corrupts. But what nobody tells you is how fast it happens when the only thing standing between someone and total control is a clipboard. Karen didn't fold after the arrests. She doubled down, dragging the whole damn neighborhood with her. It started with flyers, not just in mailboxes, but printed in grayscale, clipped to plastic stakes, stabbed into the ground at the road's entrance like military signage. Each had an aerial shot of my property, probably from a drone, labeled Zone B, non-compliant, high risk. Bullet points below, unauthorized livestock, illegal fencing configuration, documented verbal hostility to enforcement officers. The best part, subject has refused all attempts at reintegration. Neighbors are advised to avoid unsanctioned contact. I couldn't believe it. She was distributing social exile notices. But the worst part? It worked. Neighbors who used to wave stopped making eye contact. The guy who sold me feed raised his prices. A family from my 4th of July cookout posted in the community group, "We support order. We support community standards. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the risk." I stood in my field, staring at a sign about my hostile goats, and realized this wasn't a petty feud anymore. Karen was building a regime. Then she held the rally, in her driveway. No chairs, no permits, just a fold-out table, a microphone, and a poster board. Emergency compliance briefing, Tier 3 response. I stood across the street, didn't hide, just watched. At least 15 people showed up, some confused, some scared, a few already in HOA-branded safety vests. Karen tapped the mic. "We're under siege," she said, voice sharp. "And it's coming from within." She held up a flyer with my property photo. "This resident has refused compliance for 3 consecutive review cycles. He has verbally threatened officers. He has refused dialogue." She pointed at me. "He thinks he's untouchable. But no one is above the rules." She passed out flyers like communion wafers. "He may call it freedom. We call it negligence. We call it disorder." I shouted across the road. "You call a goat screaming at 6 a.m. a security threat?" Karen ignored me. Effective immediately, the HOA is initiating a community isolation protocol. Residents are discouraged from contact. No favors, no support, no engagement. The crowd nodded, some clapped. That's when I realized it wasn't just propaganda. She had followers. Later that night, I found a notice in my mailbox, laminated, not mailed. Resident classification, Tier 3, critical noncompliant. Demands: remove livestock, paint barn neutral gray, attend re-education seminar, submit apology to the board. There was a time and date for the seminar, in Karen's garage. 1 session, silent fences, how your property speaks for you. I nearly choked. This was Orwell with a polo shirt. It got worse. 2 of my trail cams went offline the next day, then a third. I checked the wiring, cut clean, deliberate. Langston came out. "You think it's her?" "She's the only one who knows where I put these," I said. He nodded. "She's not just posturing anymore." That night, a white sedan parked 2 properties down, didn't move. I watched through binoculars, tinted windows, no tags, just idling. I walked toward it with a flashlight. The engine revved, and it peeled out. Plates registered to Community Horizon Outreach. The director? Karen. She'd built a shell nonprofit to cover surveillance. Then came Max, my border collie, 8 years old, smarter than most people I've worked with. That night, I heard him whimpering near the barn. I found him behind the ATV, shaking, one paw bleeding. He yelped when I touched it, a deep cut, embedded glass. I checked the barn floor, jagged shards, green and brown, purposefully hidden. I didn't yell, didn't cry, just picked him up and whispered, "It's okay. I've got you." Langston arrived 20 minutes later, swept the area, took samples. "This wasn't an accident," he said. "This was a message." He was right. Karen had just danced over my line, and I'd reached mine. I wasn't just fighting for my land anymore. I was fighting for Max, for my peace, for every inch of dirt I'd bled for. Karen thought she could break me with a clipboard and some glass. She didn't know what I was capable of when I stopped playing nice. I'd crossed lines before, in the seals, in the desert, where the difference between survival and a body bag was a split-second decision. But this line, the one Karen Simmons danced over when she hurt Max, wasn't about survival. It was about principle. My ranch, my home, my peace. She'd taken a shard of glass to it, and I wasn't letting that slide. The next day, I went public. I uploaded everything. The video of the fake raid, the seizure warrants that looked like they'd been printed at a Kinko's, her flyers, Max's injury, the surveillance logs, the HOA's laminated re-education guides. I posted it with a caption, "When the HOA thinks they're the FBI." Within hours, the video exploded. 300,000 views in 24 hours, comments flooding in, shares lighting up my notifications. Messages poured in from rural homeowners across the country. It started here too. They called it a volunteer coalition. The documents looked real. Karen's online defenders vanished. Half her compliance team resigned. But she wasn't done. 2 days later, she showed up at my door. No clipboard, no smile, just a manila folder in her hand. Her pastel khakis were gone, replaced by a gray blazer that made her look like she'd just come from a deposition. "You think this is about goats?" she asked, voice low, eyes cold. I said nothing, just stared her down, Max growling softly at my side. "You think this ends with me?" She stepped forward, her mirrored sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. "You've kicked something you don't understand." She handed me the folder, then walked away, her SUV peeling out of my drive like she couldn't get away fast enough. I didn't open it right away, not because I was afraid, but because I knew what it meant. The folder sat on my kitchen table for 6 hours, Max limping around the room, his paw still bandaged. When I finally opened it, the top page hit me like a punch. Rural Behavioral Management. Phase 2, with government headers, agency abbreviations, real formatting, not the kind of stuff Karen could whip up at the UPS store. This wasn't just paperwork, it was doctrine. I'd seen it before, overseas, in post-conflict engagement zones, where we'd reshape communities through soft power, change the signs, change the rules, change how people talk about their neighbors. Now it was here, in a 3-ring binder, carried to my doorstep by a woman whose hobby was code enforcement cosplay. The documents laid it out: drone footage of my ranch, porch cams, audio from the barn, conversations with Langston, my routines, my habits. Subject: Callahan, classification: autonomous, strategic influence resistant. Then came the recording, my own voice, a call from years ago, outlining protocol for managing outlier behavior clusters. They hadn't just weaponized a system against me. They'd used my own damn blueprints. I'd submitted a report 12 years ago as a SEAL, outlining weaknesses in rural command structures, suggesting techniques for post-instability recalibration. They'd built this entire framework from it. Karen's HOA presidency, funded, promoted, managed, was a beta rollout under a shell nonprofit. She wasn't the architect, she was the instrument. And I wasn't the enemy, I was the test. Langston pulled up 2 hours later. I slid the folder across the table without a word. He opened it, flipped through, page by page. "Where'd you get this?" "She gave it to me," I said. "On purpose." Said I'd kicked something I couldn't stop. He closed the folder, called the county attorney. She came out same day, tough, sharp, with an investigator and a portable scanner. They took the folder apart, scanned every page, ran the headers, verified the stamps. She looked at me, eyes narrow. "Did you know this program?" "I knew the people who built it," I said. "I was in the room." The state got involved fast. Within 24 hours, we had a warrant. Karen's name was tied to 5 cases across county lines: false citations, impersonation, real financial loss. The goal: push out rural owners, consolidate properties, enforce uniform standards through scare tactics and bureaucracy. Karen was the test pilot, and I was the guinea pig. Langston and 2 agents rolled out the next morning, warrant in hand, cruiser out front, dash cam rolling. They knocked at Karen's house. Nothing. Knocked again, curtain shifted, no answer. Finally, she opened the door, same smug smirk, clipboard in hand like it had diplomatic immunity. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked, voice icy. Langston held it up. She didn't flinch. "You're making a mistake." "You first," he said, stepping inside. The search started in her study. Books, maps, a fake HOA ledger. Then the real find. Behind a false panel in the bookshelf, a narrow doorway, no knob, just a sliding latch. Inside, a back office, surgical, wall-to-wall binders, a whiteboard with names and faces, maps, schedules, rotation charts, a bank of monitors, all turned off. 3 had camera feeds paused. 1 was my barn. 6 labeled binders: resident tier guide, compliance scripts, corrective language index, psychological reinforcement tactics, asset conversion model, phase 3 strategy outline. Langston flipped through the first, files on me, my property layout, my habits. Wakes around 4:50 most mornings, feeds animals by 6, occasionally leaves lights on in the front room past midnight, rarely seen with visitors. Pattern rating: defiant, autonomous, vigilant. "They were profiling you," Langston said. "Not just me," I replied. He flipped again, 6 other names, all categorized: compliant, exit achieved, pending disruption. The last one had moved out last month. They found a wall map, 3 counties, red pins, blue pins, black pins, each labeled P1, probationary, P2, persuasion, P3, physical relocation encouraged. Langston stepped back. "This isn't HOA. This is psychological warfare. We bagged everything." The attorney filed charges that afternoon: criminal harassment, wire fraud, identity manipulation, illegal surveillance, impersonating a public official, conspiracy to defraud. Karen's lawyer tried to spin it: a community experiment in grassroots cohesion. Langston called it what it was: a cult with a mailing list. That night, someone knocked at my gate. Jerry, the neighbor who'd stopped waving. He looked broken. "I didn't know it would go this far," he said, eyes on the dirt. "You believed her?" I asked. He didn't answer. She told us if we didn't help enforce it, we'd be next. I nodded once, closed the gate. 2 days later, the county cracked the last hard drive. Files on 6 other properties, video reports, drone footage, fencing audits, voice recordings from porch conversations. These people didn't just want your land. They wanted to watch you, predict you, control you, then erase you. Karen wasn't the only node in the system. One signature on the Phase 2 proposal was someone I knew, an old intel officer, retired, last seen consulting in D.C. I stared at it, not shocked, but steady. I knew exactly what kind of people they were, and what they'd do to keep their blueprint from unraveling. One last drive was labeled Phase 4, contingency, locked, encrypted, but the title said enough. Phase 3 was about control. Phase 4 meant they were planning for resistance, and they were ready to act. The drone came back at 4:12 a.m. Same low hum, different model, faster, smaller, smarter. It swept low across the barn roof, buzzed the tree line, disappeared. 15 minutes later, I found a circle burned into the ground near the north fence. Perfectly symmetrical, black paint, 2 slash lines cutting through like an X. Same symbol Langston found on the Clearwater property, same one used on their non-compliant targets. It wasn't a warning, it was a marking. They were coming. They didn't knock, didn't call, didn't send a flyer, they just walked in. 3 of them, no headlights, no vehicle in sight. I spotted them on the southwest cam first. Thermal signature said they'd been in the woods for 20 minutes. Now they approached my driveway, black vests, boots, walkie-talkies muted. One held a clipboard, the other 2 had rifles. Real ones, clean, tightly slung. I didn't panic. I shut the laptop, locked the barn, walked to the porch, watched them. They didn't speak, neither did I. Clipboard guy stepped forward. We're here for seizure protocol. You think this is legal? I asked. He didn't blink. You failed to comply with re-education notices. Your vehicle and property are listed as forfeitable under Emergency Clause B9. You've been designated a primary resistance node. The man to his right twitched, kept glancing at the trees, adjusting his grip. The one on the left, too calm, eyes glassy, focused on the door behind me. You're outnumbered, clipboard guy said. Don't make this hard. I stepped forward 1 pace. Who trained you? He hesitated. That's when I knew they weren't real law, not military. They were believers. They took another step. I stepped back, tapped the silent trigger on my watch. Steel barriers rose from the driveway with a low hiss. Motion sensors pinged, floodlights engaged, not steady beams, strobes, red, disorienting. Clipboard guy shielded his eyes, twitchy guy raised his rifle. Mistake. My deck rig kicked in. 2 flashbangs deployed from opposite corners. No shrapnel, just pressure and sound, loud enough to reset your brain for 30 seconds. They dropped. As they flailed, I moved under the side stair, rolled right, hit the fail-safe line. A buried cable I hadn't tested in 2 years, rigged for equipment haulers. Across the field, for directional sirens fired up, piercing, oscillating, bouncing off the barn, scattering echoes. Twitchy guy staggered, rifle half-raised, blind. I closed the distance, grabbed the barrel, twisted, drove his shoulder into the gravel with my full weight. He didn't fight. The calm one turned to run but stopped cold. Langston's cruiser had arrived. No siren, no lights, just his voice. Weapons down now. Langston stepped out, sidearm drawn, back up behind him. Real law, real response. Clipboard guy reached for something. Langston fired a warning shot into the dirt, a puff of dust between the man's boots. He froze. I said now, Langston barked. They dropped their weapons. 4 more emerged from the woods, hands raised, 7 in total, armed, trained poorly but enough to be dangerous. Langston cuffed the first one, turned to me. They said they're part of something bigger. They're not bluffing, I said. Karen, her playbook, her language, her followers. Langston held up a badge from one of their vests. Enforcement Tier 1, Phase 4 certified. You know what that means. I do now, I said. At the station, they processed all 7. Most wouldn't talk, but the quiet one did, right before they loaded him into the cruiser. He looked at me through the bars, smiled. Phase 4 isn't about you. I didn't speak. You think it ends here? You think this was about land? He leaned closer. It's about pattern disruption. You're not the enemy. You're the prototype. Then he winked, and they took him away. We found more on them: forged IDs, maps, training schedules, a laminated citizen arrest card. The most disturbing: a group photo, 10 people in vests, fake patches, Karen in the middle, title above. Phase 4 Ground Team, Unit 7. There were at least 6 more. Langston and I stood on the porch later that night, Max at my feet. "You think they'll come again?" he asked. "They won't stop," I said. "Not until this goes public or I disappear." He looked at me sideways. "You have a plan?" I nodded toward the last uncracked drive on my table, labeled with my name. "You gonna open it?" "Not yet," I said. "What are you waiting for?" "Leverage." Inside that drive was the final piece, and once I opened it, once I saw what they had on me, I wouldn't just be defending my land. I'd be dragging the truth out of the shadows, and it wouldn't just end Karen's legacy, it might end mine. The drive didn't come with a label, just my name, Callahan, sharpened in block letters. It sat on my kitchen table for 4 days, not because I was scared, but because I knew once I opened it, there'd be no going back. Langston offered to run it through evidence systems. I said no. If they'd spent this much time watching me, they deserved to see me watching back. When I finally clicked it open, the screen flashed, a logo, OPRM, Operational Rural Management. Not HOA, not county, not Karen Federal. A program I hadn't heard mentioned in a decade. I knew the name because I'd helped write part of it. 12 years ago, I'd submitted a report, outlined weaknesses in rural command structures, suggested techniques for post-instability recalibration. They'd built this framework from it. 4 folders: Phase 1, Infiltration; Phase 2, Conditioning; Phase 3, Pressure; Phase 4, Correction. Inside, drone footage, porch cams, audio, my conversations with Langston, my routines. Subject: Callahan. Classification: autonomous, strategic influence resistant. Then the recording, my voice, outlining protocol for managing outlier behavior clusters. They'd used my own blueprints. Karen's HOA was a beta rollout. She was the instrument, I was the test. The final file, a video. Karen appeared, clean, calm, smiling like this was a church announcement. "If you're watching this, you saw the truth. I didn't start this, but I believed in it. Still do. People like you. You don't obey, you disrupt. That's why we needed you. You showed us what resistance looks like, and how to break it." The screen cut to black. I sat in silence, not broken, but steady. Langston showed up an hour later. "You opened it?" I nodded. "How bad?" "Bad enough." "What now?" I ended. "I didn't go to the press. I went to the source. Filed a federal whistleblower complaint, redacted the neighbors, named the contractors, attached every file, then hit publish. The story went wide. Former employees came forward. Oversight hearings opened. Karen was indicted again, this time on federal charges. OPRM was officially decommissioned again. But paperwork doesn't stop ideology. Things are quiet now. Max still limps, but he runs the barn. The goats yell. The fences stay up. The wait doesn't leave. Max growls when a truck slows at the gate. It never stops, but it never doesn't pause. I get messages from strangers. It started here too. They called it a volunteer coalition. We thought we were the only ones. They ask what to do. I say the same thing. Don't wait for someone else to fight your battle. If they've drawn the map, you're already on it. One final email was buried in the drive, encrypted, hidden. We cracked it. No body, no signature, just a subject. Reassignment pilot zone, Midwest beta. Coordinates: not Simmons Valley, somewhere colder, flatter, easier to disappear. Phase 4 didn't end here. It just moved down the list. They thought I was the glitch. I wasn't. So there you have it. Karen Simmons and her fake HOA cops thought they could just waltz in and take my 120 acres without a fight, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. I held on to what's mine, dragged their dirty little scheme into the light, and showed everyone you can't let people walk all over what you've worked your tail off to build. But it ain't over yet. I heard their Phase 4 has moved on to somewhere else, and I know they'll be back. Maybe not for me, but for someone out there. This is HOA Karen Files, where we share stories like this so you know how to handle folks like Karen. Got any run-ins with someone like that? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next episode. See y'all soon, and next time, I'll be even more ready.